The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Texas as Samuel Morrison stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching his cattle graze in the distance. At 57 years old, he had built one of the most successful ranches in 3 counties through hard work, smart investments, and careful planning. The Morrison Ranch stretched over 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, and Samuel employed nearly 40 ranch hands to keep the operation running smoothly. Samuel had seen many things in his years on the plains, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter on this particular Tuesday morning in September 1887. The sound of approaching horses caught his attention, and he squinted against the rising sun to make out the figures riding toward his ranch house. What he saw made his blood run cold. A woman, barely more than a girl really, sat hunched over in the saddle of a tired-looking mare. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle that Samuel quickly realized was a baby. Behind her, 3 riders followed at a steady pace, their faces hard and determined. Samuel set down his coffee mug and stepped off the porch. Something about the scene felt wrong, dangerous even. The woman's posture spoke of desperation and fear, while the men behind her had the look of hunters closing in on their prey. As the group drew closer, Samuel could see the woman more clearly. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with the olive skin and dark features that suggested Mexican heritage. Her eyes darted frantically between Samuel and the men behind her, and he could see tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. The woman reached Samuel's yard first, and, without hesitation, she slipped from her horse and rushed toward him. The baby in her arms began to cry, a thin, weak sound that spoke of hunger and exhaustion. The woman fell to her knees in the dust at Samuel's feet, looking up at him with eyes filled with terror and hope. "Por favor, senor," she gasped, her English heavily accented but clear. "Would you buy our freedom?" She held the baby tighter against her chest, and Samuel could see that the child was very young, perhaps only a few months old. "Please, they want to take us back. We cannot go back." Samuel stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what he was hearing. The 3 riders had now reached his yard and dismounted, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. The leader of the group, a tall man with a graying beard and cold blue eyes, stepped forward. "Morning, Morrison," the man said with the tip of his hat. "Name's Jake Hartwell. We're tracking some runaway property, and it looks like they've ended up on your land." Samuel's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Hartwell meant by property, and it made his stomach turn. Though slavery had been officially abolished over 20 years ago, the practice continued in various forms throughout the Southwest, particularly in remote areas where law enforcement was scarce, and powerful men could still treat human beings as possessions. "I don't see any property here," Samuel replied carefully, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "Just a woman and her child who appeared to need help." Hartwell's smile was cold and predatory. "Now, Morrison, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. That there's Maria Consuela Valdez and her bastard child. They belong to Don Eduardo Ramirez, and we've been hired to bring them back to his estate." The woman, Maria, looked up at Samuel with desperate eyes. "He lies, senor. Don Eduardo, he is not my master. He took me from my village when I was 15. He forced me to work in his house, forced me to—" Her voice broke, and she couldn't continue. Samuel studied her face, seeing the truth written in every line of fear and desperation. He had heard stories of men like Don Eduardo Ramirez, wealthy landowners who operated their estates like feudal kingdoms, taking whatever they wanted and crushing anyone who dared to oppose them. "The child," Samuel asked quietly, "is it his?" Maria's sob was answer enough, but she nodded anyway. "I try to love the baby despite how it came to be. When Don Eduardo said he would sell us both to pay his gambling debts, I knew I had to run. This little one deserves better than to grow up as someone's property." Hartwell spat in the dust. "Pretty story, but it doesn't change the facts. They're worth $500 to us, Morrison. You can hand them over peaceful-like, or we can take them by force. Your choice." Samuel looked down at Maria, then at the baby in her arms. The child had stopped crying and was looking up at him with large, dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for one so young. In that moment, Samuel made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "What if I were to buy them from you?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Hartwell's eyes lit up with greed. "Well now, that's a different conversation altogether. What kind of price did you have in mind?" Samuel thought quickly. He had money in the bank, more than enough to meet whatever price they might set. But he also knew that paying these men would only encourage them to continue their brutal trade. Still, if it meant saving Maria and her child, he was willing to pay any price. 500, you said? I'll give you 700 cash if you ride away now and never come back." The three men exchanged glances, and Samuel could see the greed warring with suspicion in their faces. $700 was more money than most working men saw in 2 years, but it also seemed too easy. "What's your game, Morrison?" Hartwell asked suspiciously. "Why would you pay that much for a Mexican girl and her baby?" Samuel straightened to his full height, letting his hand rest casually near his own gun. "That's my business. Do you want the money or not?" Maria was still kneeling in the dust, clutching her baby and looking between Samuel and the bounty hunters with barely concealed terror. The baby had begun to fuss again, and she rocked gently, murmuring soft words in Spanish. Hartwell considered the offer for a long moment, his cold eyes calculating. Finally, he nodded. 700 cash, and we ride away clean. But Morrison, if word gets out that you're paying good money for runaways, you're going to have every desperado in 3 states showing up at your door. Samuel nodded grimly. "I'll take that risk. Wait here." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Maria kneeling in the yard with the 3 bounty hunters standing over her like vultures. His heart pounded as he climbed the steps to his front door, knowing that he was about to commit an act that could bring serious consequences down on his head. Inside his study, Samuel opened the heavy safe hidden behind a painting of longhorn cattle. He counted out $700 in gold and silver coins, the weight of the money heavy in his hands. This was more than most of his ranch hands made in a year, but he didn't hesitate. He had seen the truth in Maria's eyes, and he knew what kind of life awaited her, and her child if these men took them back. When Samuel returned to the yard, he found the scene unchanged. Maria was still kneeling in the dust, her baby now sleeping against her shoulder. The bounty hunters stood in a semicircle around her, their hands never straying far from their weapons. "Here's your money," Samuel said, extending a leather pouch toward Hartwell. $700, as agreed. Hartwell took the pouch and quickly counted the contents, his face breaking into a satisfied grin. "Pleasure doing business with you, Morrison. The girl and the baby are yours now, fair and square." The 3 men mounted their horses without another word, riding away across the plains as quickly as they had come. Samuel watched them go, ensuring they were truly gone before turning his attention to Maria, who was still kneeling in the dust of his yard. "You can get up now," Samuel said gently. "They're gone." Maria looked up at him with confusion and wonder. "You really bought us? We are free." Samuel reached down and helped her to her feet, noting how thin she was beneath her torn dress. "You were always free. I just convinced them to go away and leave you alone." Tears began flowing down Maria's cheeks again, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed in terror. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. "How can I ever repay you? I have nothing but this baby and the clothes on my back." Samuel looked at the young woman standing before him, holding her child with fierce protectiveness despite her exhaustion. He thought of his own lonely life on the ranch, of the empty rooms in his large house that had never heard the sound of children's laughter. His wife had died in childbirth 10 years earlier, taking their unborn child with her, and he had lived alone ever since. "You don't need to repay me anything," Samuel said quietly. "But if you're willing, I could use help around the house." The work would be honest work, and you'd be paid fair wages. You and the baby would have a safe place to live, good food, and protection. Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. You would do this for us? After everything? Samuel nodded. Everyone deserves a chance at a free life. That includes you and your child. The baby chose that moment to wake up and begin crying again, the sound weak and plaintive. Maria looked down at the child with concern, and Samuel could see that both mother and baby were in need of immediate care. Come inside, Samuel said, gesturing toward the house. We need to get some food into both of you, and the baby needs attention. As they walked toward the large ranch house, Samuel couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. He was now responsible for the welfare of a young woman and her infant child, both of whom were likely being hunted by powerful and dangerous men. The bounty hunters might have taken his money and ridden away, but Samuel knew that Don Eduardo Ramirez was not likely to give up so easily on what he considered his property. Inside the house, Samuel led Maria to the kitchen, a large, well-appointed room that had seen little use since his wife's death. Maria stood uncertainly near the doorway, still clutching her baby, as if she couldn't quite believe that she was truly safe. Sit down, Samuel said, pulling out a chair at the large wooden table. Let me see what we have for food. Maria sank into the chair gratefully, and Samuel could see how exhausted she truly was. Her face was pale beneath the dirt and grime, and her hands shook slightly as she held her baby. The child was still crying a thin, persistent wail that spoke of hunger and discomfort. Samuel rummaged through his pantry and found some bread, cheese, and preserved meat. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. He also heated some milk on the stove, thinking that it might help quiet the baby. How long since you've eaten? Samuel asked as he set the simple meal before Maria. 2 days, maybe 3, Maria replied, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. I was afraid to stop, afraid they would catch us. The baby, she has not eaten well since we left. Samuel watched as Maria tried to eat while still holding her crying child. After a moment, he gently reached out his arms. May I? Maria hesitated for a moment, then carefully transferred the baby to Samuel's arms. The child looked impossibly small and fragile against his broad chest, and he felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. What's her name? Samuel asked softly, looking down at the baby's small, perfect face. Isabella, Maria replied around a mouthful of bread. I named her for my grandmother, who was a strong woman. I hope she will be strong too. Samuel nodded, gently rocking the baby as Maria ate. Isabella's cries gradually subsided, and she looked up at him with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. In that moment, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond his ranch and his cattle. Maria, Samuel said carefully, I need you to understand something. The man who was looking for you, Don Eduardo Ramirez, he's not going to give up easily. Those bounty hunters might be gone, but he'll send others. Are you prepared for that? Maria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and fear flickered across her features again. I know he will not stop, but I cannot go back, senor. I would rather die than return to that place. And Isabella, she deserves to grow up free. Samuel nodded grimly. Then, we'll need to be ready for them. My ranch is isolated, but it's also defensible. I have good men working for me, men I trust. We can protect you and Isabella, but it won't be easy. As if sensing the seriousness of the conversation, baby Isabella began to fuss again. Samuel stood and walked to the window, gently bouncing the child as he looked out across his vast ranch. In the distance, he could see his cattle grazing peacefully and his ranch hands going about their daily work, unaware that their boss had just made a decision that would put them all at risk. But as Samuel looked down at the baby in his arms, and then back at Maria eating her first real meal in days, he knew he had made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, and the freedom of an innocent woman and child was certainly one of them. The sound of approaching horses made Samuel tense, but when he looked out the window, he saw his foreman, Tom Bradley, riding up to the house with two of the other ranch hands. Tom had been with Samuel for over 15 years and was one of the few men Samuel trusted completely. "Looks like we're about to have some explaining to do," Samuel said to Maria, who had stopped eating and was looking toward the door with renewed fear. "It's all right," Samuel assured her. "Tom is a good man. If we're going to protect you and Isabella, we're going to need help, and Tom is someone we can trust." A moment later, there's a knock at the front door, followed by Tom's familiar voice calling out, "Boss, everything all right? We saw some riders heading away from the house earlier." Samuel handed Isabella back to Maria and walked to the front door, opening it to find Tom standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. Behind him, two younger ranch hands waited nervously by their horses. "Come in, Tom," Samuel said. "We need to talk." Tom Bradley was a tall, lean man in his early 40s, with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. He had been Samuel's right-hand man for years, helping to build the Morrison Ranch into the successful operation it had become. If anyone could understand and support Samuel's decision, it would be Tom. Samuel led Tom into the kitchen, where Maria sat holding Isabella, her eyes downcast. Tom took one look at the scene and immediately understood that something significant had happened. "Tom," Samuel said simply, "I want you to meet Maria and her daughter Isabella. They're going to be staying with us." Tom nodded politely to Maria, his experienced eyes taking in her torn clothes, her obvious exhaustion, and the fear that still lingered in her features. He had seen enough of the world to recognize a woman running from something dangerous. "Ma'am," Tom said respectfully, touching the brim of his hat. "Tom," Samuel continued, "there are some men who might come looking for Maria and Isabella. Dangerous men. I need to know if I can count on you and the other hands to help protect them." Tom didn't hesitate for even a moment. "You know you can count on me, boss. And most of the boys feel the same way. We've all heard stories about what goes on at some of those big estates south of here. If this lady and her baby need protection, they'll have it." The relief that washed over Samuel's face was evident. He had hoped Tom would support his decision, but hearing it confirmed made the weight on his shoulders feel a little lighter. "What about the law?" Tom asked practically. "Are we going to have trouble with the sheriff?" Samuel shook his head. "Sheriff Mason is a good man. He knows the difference between right and wrong. As long as we don't go looking for trouble, I don't think he'll give us any problems." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "What do you need me to do?" "Post extra guards around the ranch, especially at night," Samuel replied. "Make sure all the men are armed and know to be on the lookout for strangers. And, Tom, not a word of this to anyone outside the ranch. The fewer people who know about Maria and Isabella, the better." "Understood, boss. I'll talk to the men tonight. Let them know what's what. You can count on us." After Tom left to organize the ranch's defenses, Samuel returned to the kitchen to find Maria finishing her meal. She looked up at him with gratitude and something that might have been the beginning of hope. "Your man, he seems good," Maria said softly. "Kind." Samuel nodded. "Tom Bradley is one of the best men I know. He's been with me through good times and bad, and he's never let me down. If he says the men will protect you, you can believe it." Isabella had fallen asleep in Maria's arms, finally quiet and peaceful. Samuel looked at the sleeping child and felt again that strange surge of protectiveness. This little girl would grow up free, he promised himself. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, she would never know the kind of slavery her mother had endured. "Maria," Samuel said gently, "I want you to understand something. You're not my employee or my servant. You're a free woman, and this is your home for as long as you want it to be. The work I mentioned, helping around the house, that's only if you want to do it. You don't owe me anything." Maria's eyes filled with tears again. "In my whole life, no one has ever been so kind. I don't know how to repay such kindness." "You don't need to repay it," Samuel said simply. "Just take care of yourself and Isabella and Try to find some peace here. That's payment enough for me. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Samuel showed Maria to one of the guest bedrooms upstairs. The room was large and comfortable with a big four-poster bed and windows that looked out over the vast expanse of the ranch. A small adjoining room would serve perfectly as a nursery for Isabella. "This is yours," Samuel said, setting down the small bundle of Maria's possessions that she had managed to bring with her. "Tomorrow we'll get you some proper clothes and whatever else you and Isabella need." Maria stood in the center of the room, holding her sleeping baby and looking around in wonder. After years of living as little more than a slave, the luxury of a real bed and a room of her own seemed almost unbelievable. "Senor Morrison," she said softly, "I want you to know that I am not afraid to work. I can cook, clean, tend animals, whatever you need. I will earn my place here." Samuel smiled, the first real smile he had managed in years. "I'm sure you will, Maria. But for now, just rest. You've been through enough for one day." As Samuel closed the door and left Maria alone with her child, he couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed in the span of a single day. This morning he had been a lonely rancher, going through the motions of his daily routine. Tonight, he had a purpose beyond his cattle and his land. He had two human beings depending on him for their safety and their freedom. The challenges ahead would be significant, he knew. Don Eduardo Ramirez would not give up easily, and the dangers facing Maria and Isabella were far from over. But as Samuel walked down the hallway of his large, empty house, he realized that for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty anymore. Outside, the sun was setting over the Texas plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. In the distance, Samuel could see his ranch hands checking the cattle and securing the property for the night. The normal rhythms of ranch life continued, but underneath the surface, everything had changed. Samuel Morrison had made his choice, and there would be no turning back. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on with the determination and courage that had built his ranch and his reputation. Maria and Isabella were under his protection now, and he would not let them down. As darkness fell over the Morrison ranch, Samuel stood on his front porch one last time before turning in for the night. In the distance, he thought he could see riders on the horizon, though it might have been just shadows and imagination. Either way, he and his men would be ready. The fight for freedom had only just begun. 3 weeks had passed since Maria and Isabella arrived at the Morrison Ranch, and life had settled into a comfortable routine. Maria proved to be everything she had promised, and more. She cooked meals that filled the house with wonderful aromas, tended a small garden behind the kitchen, and kept the large ranch house spotlessly clean. But more than that, she brought life and warmth to rooms that had been cold and empty for too long. Isabella was thriving under the care and regular feeding. The thin, sickly baby who had arrived clinging to her mother's chest had grown into a healthy, alert infant who smiled and gurgled contentedly. Samuel found himself stopping by the nursery several times each day, drawn by the sound of Isabella's laughter or Maria's gentle singing as she worked. The ranch hands had taken to both mother and child with surprising enthusiasm. Tom Bradley had quietly spread the word about their situation, and to a man, the workers had rallied around their protection. Cookie, the ranch cook, had been particularly pleased to have Maria take over the kitchen duties, as it freed him to focus on feeding the hands and managing supplies. But beneath this surface calm, tension was building. Samuel's network of contacts in the surrounding area had begun reporting disturbing news. Don Eduardo Ramirez was not a man to accept losses quietly, and word was spreading that he was offering increasingly large rewards for information about his missing property. More concerning still were reports of armed riders moving through the region, asking questions and making threats. On a crisp October morning, Samuel was reviewing supply lists in his study when Tom Bradley knocked on the door. The foreman's expression was grim, and Samuel immediately knew that the news he brought would not be good. "Boss, "We've got trouble coming," Tom said without preamble as he closed the door behind him. "Jake Morrison from the Flying W rode in about an hour ago. Says there's been men asking about Maria and the baby in town. Hard men, the kind that don't take no for an answer." Samuel set down his papers and leaned back in his chair. He had been expecting this moment for weeks, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. How many men? And what exactly were they asking? Jake says there were at least 6 of them, maybe more. They were showing around a drawing of Maria, asking if anyone had seen her. When people said no, they started making threats. Told the shopkeepers that anyone harboring runaways would regret it. Samuel nodded grimly. Did they mention the ranch specifically? Not yet, but Jake thinks it's only a matter of time. They're being systematic, checking every farm and ranch in a 50-mile radius. We've got maybe a day or two before they show up here. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made both men turn toward the door. A moment later, there was a soft knock, and Maria's voice called out, "Senor Morrison? I brought coffee." "Come in, Maria," Samuel called back, exchanging a glance with Tom. Maria entered carrying a tray with 3 cups of steaming coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand that something was wrong, and worry was evident in her dark eyes. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked quietly as she set down the tray. "Don Eduardo's men." Samuel stood and moved to the window, looking out across his ranch. In the distance, he could see some of his hands working with the cattle, their movements calm and routine. It was hard to believe that violence might soon shatter the peace of this place. "It looks that way," Samuel admitted. "But, Maria, I want you to understand something. We're not going to let them take you and Isabella. I gave you my word, and I intend to keep it." Maria wrapped her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. "You don't understand what kind of man Don Eduardo is. He has money, power, connections with corrupt officials. He doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. If you fight him, he will destroy everything you have built here." Tom stepped forward, his voice steady and reassuring. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know what kind of men we are either. This ranch wasn't built by men who backed down from a fight, and we're not about to start now." Samuel turned from the window and studied Maria's frightened face. In the weeks she had been at the ranch, she had begun to lose the hollow, haunted look of someone living in constant fear. She had gained weight, and there were moments when he caught her smiling or humming as she worked. The thought of that light being extinguished filled him with a cold anger that surprised him with its intensity. "Maria," Samuel said gently, "I need you to tell me everything you know about Don Eduardo's operation. How many men does he have? What kind of weapons? How does he think?" Maria sank into one of the leather chairs, her hands trembling slightly. "He has maybe 30 men who work for him, but only about 15 are fighters. The rest are workers, farmers. But the fighters, they're dangerous men. Killers. He recruits them from across the border, men with nothing to lose." She paused, gathering her courage to continue. "Don Eduardo is smart, but he is also proud. Too proud. He thinks that money and fear can solve any problem. He will not expect you to fight him seriously. He will think that a few threats, maybe some violence, will make you give up." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That could work in our favor. If he's overconfident, he might not bring enough men for a real fight." Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Maria. "What about the law? You mentioned corrupt officials." "Sheriff Martinez in San Miguel is in Don Eduardo's pocket," Maria replied. "But that is 2 days' ride from here. I don't know about the law closer to your ranch." "Sheriff Mason is an honest man," Samuel said firmly. "The problem is that he only has 2 deputies to cover a huge territory. By the time we could get word to him and he could respond, it would probably be too late." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at a gallop. Through the window, Samuel could see one of his younger hands, Billy Patterson, riding hard toward the house. The young man's face was flushed with excitement and fear. Tom was already moving toward the door. "I'll see what Billy's found." A few minutes later, Tom returned with Billy in tow. The young cowhand was breathing hard and struggling to get his words out. "Boss," Billy gasped. "I was checking the south fence line when I saw them. Riders, maybe 8 or 10 of them, camped about 5 miles from here. They've got spyglasses and they're watching the ranch." Samuel felt his blood run cold. "How long have they been there?" "Hard to say for sure, but the ashes from their fire look like they've been there at least since yesterday, maybe longer. They're not hiding, boss. They want us to know they're watching." Maria had gone pale, and her hands were shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. "That's his way. Don Eduardo likes to let people know he's coming. He thinks fear will make them give up without a fight." Samuel stood and began pacing, his mind racing through options and possibilities. The ranch was defensible, but only if they had enough warning to prepare. If Don Eduardo's men were already in position, watching and planning, the situation was more serious than he had hoped. "Tom," Samuel said decisively, "I want every man armed and ready for trouble. Set up watches around the clock, and make sure someone is always watching those riders to the south. If they move, I want to know about it immediately." "What about the women and children?" Tom asked. Several of the married hands lived on the ranch with their families. "Get them to town," Samuel replied without hesitation. "I won't have innocent people caught in the middle of this. Anyone who doesn't want to fight can leave with them. No questions asked and no hard feelings." Billy spoke up, his young voice determined. "Boss, I'm not going anywhere. This ranch is my home, and Miss Maria and little Isabella are part of our family now. I'll stand with you." Samuel felt a surge of pride and gratitude for the loyalty of his men. These were good people, honest working folks who understood the difference between right and wrong. They deserved better than to be dragged into a war that wasn't of their making, but he was grateful beyond words for their support. "All right then," Samuel said. "Tom, get the men organized. I want to talk to Maria alone for a few minutes." After Tom and Billy left, Samuel closed the door and returned to his chair. Maria was still pale, but he could see determination building in her eyes alongside the fear. "Samuel," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time since she had arrived, "there is something else you should know about Don Eduardo. He is not just cruel, he is also a coward. He never fights his own battles if he can help it. He will send his men to do the dangerous work while he stays safe." Samuel nodded. "That's good to know. What about his lieutenant, the man who leads his fighters?" "Carlos Mendoza," Maria replied with a shudder. "He is the opposite of Don Eduardo. A fighter, a killer. He enjoys violence. If Carlos is leading the men watching us, then Don Eduardo is very serious about getting us back." The babies crying from upstairs interrupted their conversation, and Maria stood to go tend to her daughter. But at the doorway, she stopped and turned back to Samuel. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could give us back to them and return to your peaceful life. Why risk everything for people you barely know?" Samuel considered the question seriously. It was one he had asked himself many times over the past 3 weeks, especially in the quiet moments when he wondered if he was making a terrible mistake that would cost him everything he had worked to build. "My father used to tell me that a man's character isn't measured by what he does when it's easy," Samuel said finally. "It's measured by what he does when it's hard, when doing the right thing costs him something. You and Isabella deserve to be free, Maria. That's worth fighting for." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "Isabella is lucky to have you as a protector. We both are." After Maria left to tend to the baby, Samuel remained in his study, staring out the window at his ranch and thinking about the battles to come. He had built this place with his own hands, turning raw prairie into productive ranch land through years of backbreaking work. Now he was putting it all at risk for a woman and child he had known for less than a month. But as the sound of Isabella's laughter drifted down from upstairs, mingled with Maria's gentle voice singing a Spanish lullaby, Samuel knew he had made the right choice. Some things were more important than land or cattle or money. Some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant losing everything else. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as the ranch prepared for what might come. Tom Bradley proved his worth once again, organizing the defense with military efficiency. The married hands and their families were loaded into wagons and sent to town, where they could stay with friends or at the hotel until the danger passed. Several of the single hands chose to go with them, which Samuel understood and respected. Fighting for principle was one thing, but no one should be forced to risk their life for someone else's cause. In the end, 13 men remained at the ranch. Samuel, Tom Bradley, Cookie the cook, Billy Patterson, and 9 others who had decided that the Morrison Ranch was worth defending. They were outnumbered, but they knew the land, and they had good defensive positions. More importantly, they were fighting for something they believed in. As evening approached, Samuel found himself on the front porch again, this time armed with his rifle and watching the southern horizon for any sign of movement. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and he could see for miles across the rolling plains. Somewhere out there, Don Eduardo's men were watching and planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tom Bradley joined him on the porch, carrying his own rifle and a pair of field glasses. "I've posted guards at all the approaches," he reported. "Cookie's got plenty of ammunition distributed, and we've moved all the horses into the main corral where we can keep an eye on them." Samuel nodded his approval. "What about supplies?" "Enough food and water to last us a week, maybe more if we're careful. The well is protected, so they can't cut off our water supply easily." From upstairs came the sound of Maria singing softly to Isabella, a Spanish melody that spoke of home and safety and love. It was a beautiful sound, and it reminded Samuel of everything he was fighting to protect. "Tom," Samuel said quietly, "if things go bad, if it looks like we can't hold them off, I want you to take Maria and Isabella and get them out of here. There's a back trail through the creek bottom that leads to the Patterson place. Old John Patterson is a good man, and he'll help them get to safety." Tom was quiet for a long moment before responding. "If things go that bad, boss, we'll all be dead. But I give you my word, if there's breath left in my body, I'll see that lady and her baby get to safety." Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders.